Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our conversation about race in the workplace. I'm happy to be joined by our esteemed panelists, Louis Montgomery, Dr. Basil Smikle, Lauren Myers, and Rasan Diaz. A little bit about the agenda today. We're going to talk about a little bit of historical context, just a brief historical context. And then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists for general observations, because I think this is an important time in American history for us to have this discussion. And then we'll talk about race in the workplace, and again, turn it over to the panelists for their thoughts. And we want to really focus on solutions and takeaways. And so some of the practices that they've encountered, some of the observations that they've seen within the workplace, we want to share that with you. And then finally, we'll have a brief, maybe 10, 15 minute or maybe longer Q&A for the panelists. Okay, so let's get started. Again, we want to focus on education, and we want to focus on how we can get, you know, some real key solutions and takeaways to practice in our world of work, in our respective world of work. All right, so I'm going to start with Peter Tosh. Many of you may or may not know Peter Tosh, one of the Wailers, one of Bob Marley and the Wailers, one of the founders of the Wailers. And he had a song that was written back in 1972. It actually came out on the Catch a Fire album. And there was another song on that album, Burning and Looting, which we'll talk about in a second. But Peter Tosh said it was 400 years of the same philosophy. And that's really what I want to begin with today, is that historical context. And I know some people, you know, 1619 may be the date. There may be a previous date when Africans were brought to North America. But in this particular context, 1619 was the date when they were brought to the Virginia colony. And when that relationship was established, you had a white population and you had enslaved Africans taken from Angola, brought to what we would come to find out is America, United States of America. And then that relationship was not an equal relationship, and that relationship was shrouded in brutality. You know, we're not going to mince any words here. And that relationship really persists to this day. And when Peter Tosh says the same philosophy, what we really want to do is break down those barriers that has really affected our minds in this country, and it's shaped our existence in this country, in America. Fast forward to 1787, when the Constitution is being discussed and is being drawn up. James Madison in Federalist 54 put forth, and I'll read it to you right now, that the chief concern was the representation of slaves in relation to taxation and representation. And many of you know this Federalist 54 became codified in the Constitution in the 3/5 clause, right, which gave the South representation, that 3 out of 5 slaves would be counted, so they would have representation. Right now, again, they didn't want to give them full representation because then the South would be much more represented in the early going of our country. And again, fast forward to the 1860s, where there is a movement by the Southern states to succeed. Right. So we talk about monuments now. When we talk about people ripping, these were people who wanted to establish the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America. They wanted to succeed from the Union and establish their own country. Naturally, Lincoln and a lot of the other people who wanted to keep America together said, hey, you can't do this. And they went to war. And let's not make any mistake about it. And I know there's been some revisionist history about why was the Civil War fought. It was fought for slavery. If you go back into the accords of the states that wanted to succeed, they plainly state that they wanted to keep the institution of slavery. So it was for that, right? And then we fast forward again after slavery now to the Jim Crow era. And again, Black people are free. They're trying to become enfranchised, right? So they say, hey, slavery, brutal, horrible institution, ripped families apart, did a lot to the psyche, but we want to be a part of America. We want to be a part of America, and we want to join and become enfranchised and exercise our rights. 1870s, there is a there's a lot of good things going on. Federal troops leave the South. Reconstruction comes to an end, Jim Crow. Jim Crow then starts, and there are over 2,000 lynchings. When we talk about brutality, there are over 2,000 lynchings between 1865 and 1877. And people say, what's going on here? Can you imagine people being ripped out of their homes and family members following to see someone strung up on a tree and lynched? So there's some really powerful forces that are going on here. And then finally, after that period is over, fast forward again to the 1960s, when we're fighting for voting rights. We're fighting for, because poll tax, the whole Jim Crow era, there was segregation. And again, I'm not going to get into the history too deeply. We all know this history. But the 1960s, which is recent memory, well, it's not that long ago. We're then fighting to come in and fighting to give Black people enfranchisement in the society. And John Lewis just died the other day, and he said good trouble. Let's start good trouble. But think about that concept. Think about it. Why is it trouble to be equal? Why is it trouble to fight for freedom? Why is it trouble to engage with people when we just want to be equal? Equal opportunity, unfettered thought and action, right? There is a white world. There is white supremacy. There is white privilege. This has been baked in. Senator Cotton, just recently, senator from Arkansas, said that slavery was a necessary evil. And you can go back to Jefferson Davis in the 1860s saying, and the president of the Confederacy, Black people were stamped from the beginning to be not equal, from the beginning. So this has been in American history, in American psyche, right? And now we take it to present day when we talk about race. And I'm looking forward to getting a lot of questions, and I'm looking forward for our insights from our panelists. And again, this is 2020, the global pandemic, but also George Floyd was brutally murdered, and that was on video, that was captured on video. So with that being said, with that context, I'd now like to introduce our panelists. First panelist, and I'm gonna go in chronological order, so don't hold that against me, Louis. Louis Montgomery Jr., 1981, ILR. Louis Montgomery leads Korn Ferry's Human Resources and Diversity Officers Professional Search Practice. He helps organize and add diversity to the C-suites, right? We talk about diversity and inclusion, how important that is. He is a practice leader in this field. 75% of his placements are women and 50% are persons of color. He's placed leaders all over healthcare, trade associations, big corporations, small corporations, government contract, industry, the entire gamut, right? The entire gamut. He leads a team of 8 individuals at Korn Ferry who conduct searches across all sectors from HR manager to the C-suite level. He specializes in diversity, right? And before moving into the search practice, he held a number of very senior human resources positions, senior vice president at Serco North America, major government contracting firm, head of talent acquisition at AES, and chief diversity officer of Kraft Foods. He's the author of a year's worth of inspiration and several thought leadership articles. I myself subscribe to Lewis's quote of the day. I would encourage all of you to do that as well. He's been doing that for many, many, many years. He also has articles about Starbucks' battle against bias. We all remember the Starbucks incidents from a couple years ago. And he is leading the Golden Talent and Next Generation Diversity Officers Research Study on leadership competencies of what it takes to be a diversity officer in corporate America. He recently was quoted in the Path to Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer in the training industry, again, a thought leader in this field. He graduated from Cornell, majored in ILR. While at Cornell, he was a varsity letter winner in football and track. He is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. He is also a member of the Christian Brothers College High School Hall of Fame and the Cornell ILR Association Board of Directors. He is the chairman of the Senior Human Resources Executive Forum, a senior HR group based in Washington, D.C. He's an avid golfer and he coaches youth baseball. Welcome, Louis.
And thank you for that kind introduction.
You're most welcome, sir. Next up, graduated in 1993, Dr. Basil Smikle, Jr. Dr. Smikle has been a political strategist and policy advisor for almost 20 years with local, national, and international experience. As a consultant, he advises both the private sector and the public sector on a host of different things, nonprofit, communications, marketing, urban education policy, political mobilization. I myself, he also does the Sunday night reading where he puts out these books that I tell you, boy, we talk about urban policy education. Basil is definitely on that. He lectures currently at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and Teachers College, and was most recently the Distinguished Lecturer of Politics and Public Policy at CUNY. Basil holds a PhD in Politics and Education and an MPA from Columbia. We won't hold that against him, we know. His undergraduate's from Cornell. He's a familiar face on MSNBC, CNN. I mean, he's all over the place. I love to watch Basil because A, I know him and his insights are always on point. In 2015, Basil was appointed by Governor Andrew Cuomo and former Governor David Paterson to serve as executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, where he was the second highest ranking Democrat in the state. Basil has worked closely with elected officials and community leaders to manage electoral and fundraising strategies for the state. He's recruited candidates. He's worked closely with the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, to create grassroots mobilization programs and act as a party surrogate during the 2016 cycle. Under his leadership, Democrats flipped county legislatures and countywide seats, laying the foundation for the return to the state Senate to full Democratic control in 2018. New York State now is Democratic control. He has worked with Hillary Clinton and during her first campaign for the US Senate, which she successfully won in 2000. And he joined her staff as a senior aide. He's received multiple awards from Governor Andrew Cuomo. He's worked on the Highline Project. He's worked on the 9/11 support. He's a key advisor to many. The list is so numerous, Basil, I won't get into all the names. Very important for me, though, he's a lifelong New Yorker, raised in the Bronx by Jamaican immigrants. Yes. All right. He's inspired by his father, a retired textile worker, and his mother, a longtime public school special education teacher. Basil is also a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, Prince Hall Free and Accepted Masons, and 100 Black Men in New York, where he's helped to start the Eagle Academy in the Bronx, which has grown to 6 public all-boys. Eagle Academy is doing great things. If you don't know about that, please Google it. Wonderful things there in New York and New Jersey. He is a founding board member of the Harlem Hebrew Academy Charter School and sits on the board of New York City Charter School Center. Welcome, Basil.
Thank you, Krishna, for that introduction. And I hear my bio, I always remember that I need a vacation, so thank you. And I look forward to our shared discussion about our beer game. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Basil. Next up is Lauren Myers, ILR 1997. She is the owner of Dendar Consulting, a firm that focuses on human resources and talent acquisition. Lauren specializes in HR consulting and executive search for various startup and Fortune 500 companies. Lauren advises various clients nationwide, addressing policy inefficiencies in human resources, infrastructure, benefits development, talent acquisition, the entire HR life cycle, recruiting, onboarding, diversity, candidate pipelines. She also operates in the area of sports development and partnerships, and she's working with active and retired NFL players to foster opportunities beyond the field of play. Dendar provides career consulting, media training, and broker sponsorship opportunities. Lauren encourages athletes to give back to their communities by helping to establish foundations and promoting fundraising efforts. She is a graduate of ILR. She is a member of the Cornell University Council and the President's Council of Cornell Women, where she chairs diversity and inclusion. She's a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, go Philly, where she currently resides, raising her 4 children. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you, Krishna. I'm also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated.
You forgot to put that in your bio.
I thought it had to. I did. Go Eagles.
All right, go Giants. All right. Last up is Mr. Rasan Diaz. He is a manager, talent advisor at Health First. He was previously a talent acquisition manager at Elsevier, and he was the diversity program manager at CA Technologies. Before that, he was a director of diversity and inclusion search services at Lloyd Staffing. Rasan is a founding member of the Black Ivy and Educational Advocacy Group, and he was a co-founder of the Link at Cornell University, which is a Black male support group that has been active for over 20 years now, and it's been doing great things, helping students academically, as well as adapting to the rigors of university life. He is also a board member of Geeks Rule, a nonprofit that promotes STEM education in public schools for underrepresented minority students. Welcome, Rasan.
Thank you, Krishna. Look forward to our robust discussion today. Thank you for the room.
So, let's get started. I want to start off first with general observations about 2020 and about race in America before we turn to the world of work. Basil, can you please get us started?
Thank you very much. As I mentioned before, I'm very glad to be a part of this discussion. You laid out, I think, the historical context quite well, so I don't want to go back over that same territory. I'll just add that in a lot of my discussions publicly, and you mentioned I do a lot of work on TV, and I do talk about this point often, that we're in the midst of 2 pandemics. One brought on by a virus that has claimed the lives of 12 people that I know, 21 people in the church that I grew up in, and has certainly had a disproportionate impact on people of color, certainly African Americans. And then the other pandemic is our 400-year scourge of racism and discrimination. And in both instances, you get the sense that this country is being pushed to its seams. Our institutions were not built to handle the pressure that's being put on it right now. And in a way, going back to the John Lewis quote, that's a good thing. That is good trouble, because we had been talking for decades and perhaps longer about police brutality, but when you see 8 3/4 minutes of a police officer with his knee on the neck of a Black man in Minneapolis, it brings to the forefront all of those decades and hundreds of years of the oppression that we've been fighting against. So what's been the result? We've seen in the last several weeks and months a flurry of interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion. If I get another email about that, which is fine, that's a good thing, right? That people are paying attention. But I would say, I would give the cautionary note that I always do, which is that we should not be complacent, that there are, while individuals can be, and institutions and organizations can be well-meaning, if there aren't structures in place to make sure that these changes are durable, that that there are people in place to make sure that they are lasting, and that we create and ossify pipelines to enable a steady flow of diversity and equity and inclusion, then a lot of the current activity will, I don't want to say it'll be for naught, but it'll be short-lived. Just think about the fact, and I'll leave this here, just think about the fact that we've got a member of Congress, as you alluded to, a member of Congress who says that slavery was a necessary evil. We've got an attorney general who was on the hot seat yesterday that has said that there is no such thing as rampant racism in law enforcement and criminal justice system. We've got a president who, in an incredible irony, received an award for criminal justice reform just a year ago. And a year later has threatened to use our own military on people protesting peacefully in our nation's capital and elsewhere. And so I'm reminded that going into 2016, 28 states had restrictions on how people could vote. Many of those restrictions are still in place. The Voting Rights Act had been gutted by a Supreme Court. There is so much at stake, not just in this election, but in terms of people being able to continue to mobilize and let their voices be heard. So we're not just talking about what exists in the halls of corporate America or in government, but essentially our very opportunity and ability to exercise our rights are being challenged right now. And so I hope that this conversation doesn't just lead to potential solutions based on our own experiences and observations, but a real understanding that in both public life and private sector life, public sector and private sector life, that we need to, I think, very thoroughly and intentionally establish durable pathways for political, economic power that goes beyond this specific moment in time.
Thank you, Basil. I think durable is a very key word there. Rasan, your thoughts, please?
Yes, and thank you, Krishna and Basil. Basil, I have to agree with you on a lot of the points that you made, but I believe that in the time that we are in now, with the pandemic happening, in addition to George Floyd, Ahmaud, and Breonna Taylor, and all of the others, too many to mention here, but now feels a bit different. Now feels, as we talked on a call prior to this, a bit more visceral, a bit more emotional, right? These protests are happening not just in our country, but globally, right? So I think there's a spirit and there's an inertia that's happening now that we need to capture and maintain, right? Because I think if we don't sustain this momentum and if we don't continue to try and elevate the discussion, right, beyond just what's happening in our local communities, but really within corporations on a federal level and political leadership, unfortunately, I think, once the sort of inertia and the energy sort of dies down, that no real sustainable change will take place. And that's really what we're all advocating for. That's really what's necessary in this country for people of color to feel any sense of parity and equality in this country, is for that energy and that momentum to sustain over time and to, again, elevate the discussion to higher levels, right? And to really sort of propel change at an institutional systemic level in order for this, the metamorphosis, if you will, to really take place and to take hold. So I'm hoping that these conversations and others that continue to happen will keep that momentum going and ultimately get us to a place to where we can receive some parity in this country.
All right, thank you, Rasan. Durability, it's a global movement. Louis, your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I agree with Basil and Rashan that now feels different. I'm the, as you indicated, Chris, I'm the elder statesman of the group, and I caught as I was growing up, I caught the tail end of the civil rights movement and helped to integrate some schools as part of that. And so I've had the personal experience of living through a time where we went from segregation to integration and beyond. But I agree. Over the last few months, I have had conversations with white friends and colleagues that I have never had before. People have reached out to me, in particular after George Floyd, with concerns saying, "Hey, I don't know what to say, but I just want you to know that I'm thinking about you." And that to me is cause for optimism. I am an optimist by nature, but at the same time, I'm a realist. That as a society, we have a long way in which to go. But again, I think this time feels different in some ways. And then just to mention, to harken back to something you said, Krishna. When John Lewis recently passed, and obviously clearly a hero of the civil rights movement, and the march that he led to Selma, that led to him being beaten and those protesters being beaten, led to change. That led to the passage the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I'm hopeful that the times that we're dealing with now will lead to meaningful and, as Basil said, durable change. So I'm hopeful. And I know we're going to talk more about the workplace in a bit, and so we'll come back to those comments.
Thank you, Louis. Lauren, please, your thoughts?
I would agree with what everyone is saying. We are in uncharted territory because it's not just looking at things from a racial perspective, but that in combination with COVID and how these two pandemics are really affecting us and how we are approaching things, how we are doing things, and both our actions and our inactions, and how it can influence things moving forward. I feel that as a Black person, as a Black woman, because I've always said I'm Black before I'm a woman, and really understanding that all of the layers that, and I'm sure we all get it, all the layers of chaos and uncertainty and challenges that we face on an everyday basis are still there, but it's increased and it's amplified, and more people are seeing it and being exposed to it because we are home. So I think about things that being raised in the Black church, but being raised in a church and knowing that everything happens for a reason. We plan, God laughs, that maybe things are happening because change needs to not only be made and sustained, but I think to things that we learned in ILR, it's not just about the sustainability, it's about the scalability. So it's continuing to have these conversations and challenging ourselves to pull others in so that it can scale and continue to grow, so that it becomes more of the norm instead of just it's more of that second nature and just the automatic thing that is happening.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And now I thought it was important for our panelists to address this moment in time because it is so significant. It is really an inflection point in American history. Now we're going to segue into the world of work and how you have observed and seen, and let's kill two birds with one stone with this. We can talk about some observations to get right into what you want your key takeaways to be, because I do want to leave some time for some Q&A at the very end. We're getting a lot of great questions that are coming in, and I do want the panelists to tackle some of these questions that are coming in. But please talk about, and again, two things here, some general observations about systemic racism in the workplace, and any key takeaways that you want to leave our audience with today. Lauren, why don't you pick it up, since you're right there. We'll just continue with the flow.
For me, as a consultant and being in any sort of industry, geographically being both on the West Coast and the East Coast, and different sizes and types of organization, definitely seen a lot. And just the thing that always sticks with me around race in the workplace, not only is just the general treatment, is as that HR professional coming from the place of compensation. And we have all these discussions about equal pay, but when I look at it, I always think, and was always taught, when you get there, how can you bring others in and how can you help them? And I've seen it where, from a compensation perspective, that's your baseline, that's your starting point for your growth, how you're viewed for promotions, because it's looking what grade level, how much are they making? And so for me, it's always been trying to help those who typically don't know about those bands, don't understand and think, well, I want to have the RSUs, the stock options, this and that. It's like, and the bonus, I'm like, nope, I need you to be at a higher base, because that is your first step, that first step into the door of growth. And that I take so seriously and so personally, and how it affects not only Black people, but your family, and how you can and cannot, and what you can and cannot provide for your family and for yourself. And that's something that I see how organizations will, and other business partners will not fight, will not go to bat for Black people, but Black women especially, and will find every excuse and reason as to why not to pay someone. But when I look at their resume and take their name off, I'm like, well, this person not only is more than qualified, but should be making more than people that they'd be reporting into. And that is an observation now that I see too with the layoffs that are happening, with the decisions and the push of people coming back to work, how that is going to affect, do I choose my children and my family, or do I choose work? Right now, as I'm a single mom, and right now with are we going back to school? I don't see that happening, but I still have to figure out how to work. And it's not an option to say, at least for me, and I'm sure for other people, to say, well, hold that deadline because I've got to teach second grade math. So in the workplace especially, I feel that treatment of how the approach with us is different. With Black women, if I speak up, I know too much. If I don't speak up, it's you don't know something. How I approach a situation, am I the angry Black woman? No, there is a difference between being an angry Black woman and being a Black woman who is angry. And that is something that needs to be discussed more as well. So those are observations and
that's fantastic. I know we can't have the dynamism
right.
that we would normally have. We're on Zoom, so everyone has to be like, oh, let's mute, let's wait, let's
right.
That's perfect. Let's just go with the flow. Rasan, then Basil finish up with Lewis in terms of just get some observations out. We'll talk about takeaways after. I know we just have to. So in the workplace, systemic racism goes.
Sure. Yeah, and I would agree with Lauren on a lot of her points, but what I'm sort of seeing personally within my organization and others is a lot more emphasis and conversation around how do we do better in this space, right? How do we create, more sort of non-biased processes to enable and empower more people of color to be considered for opportunities? How do we create an internal culture that enables and empowers these folks to be able to bring their true and authentic selves to work, right? To be, that much more engaged and to provide that much more value to the organization. And that's all well and good. But, my question is to myself and to my leadership and to anyone that I speak to about these types of things is what is going to be sustainable, right? Because it's about, you can have these conversations, you can create some processes, you can do some things, tweak some things, put out a statement, right? But, what's going to be happening next year and the year after that to ensure, right, that you're moving to a place as an organization where these conversations, to Lauren's point earlier, is not even necessary, right? It just becomes a part of how you operate as an organization where you embed D&I throughout, sort of your entire workflow to get to a point to where it's just organic. It's just sort of how you operate, right? For a whole host of reasons. The other thing that I want to point out, right, is that our experience collectively, the folks on this panel and that are probably listening in, is a lot different, right? In a lot of instances from folks that are on the ground, right? We are by and large highly educated. We're doing well. We're in good roles. We're making good money. We're in positions where we can work remotely. But the lion's share of our people, unfortunately, and due to a lot of the things that Basil referenced earlier, that you referenced earlier, Krishna, are not in that position, right? Due to systemic racism and things that have happened historically that put a lot of our people in a position to where they're not able to have these types of roles and these types of jobs, right? And that's why they're being more disparately, and we are being more disparately impacted by the pandemic, by racism, because they're in situations where they don't have those opportunities, right? Where they're being laid off in droves, right? We're not getting the support, right, from the federal government through assistance, et cetera. And so, that is sort of where I think sort of the emphasis needs to be, right? How do we create more systems and processes and organizations and what have you to really lift up, those folks, right? And I think that's a part of all of our responsibility in the capacities to which we can and the roles that we have to sort of reach back and try and help lift folks up, right? Because we are fortunate in a lot of ways, and unfortunately, a lot of our folks aren't in the same position. So we need to sort of give them some focus and help to lift them up the best that we can.
Thank you, Rashawn. Basil?
I think a lot about this notion of sustainability, which has been raised. It's incredibly important to me because in so many parts of my career, I work to try to put people in positions of power. And I will make a bit of a self-deprecating statement for a second that, and talk about what it was like for me to get to Cornell. I came from pretty good schools as a typical West Indian family. We have a lot of like doctors and engineers, but no lawyers. The weird thing is I did not need a lawyer to talk to that person about a career until I was already at Cornell, right? And fast forward now to where I am in my life and career right now, I get judges elected. I get judges appointed. I work with some of the top lawyers and law firms in the country. And I'm making that point to say that so much about the trajectory of people's lives and careers depends a lot on exposure and representation, not just actual representation, but substantive representation as well. And I look at, and as we're going through this period in these last few months, I am focused a lot more on who is occupying these positions of power. So I'm going to get in trouble for something. I may get in trouble for something I'm about to say, which is that I noticed that if you notice that, Governor Cuomo, for example, is getting a lot of attention and respect for his leadership through this pandemic. But what I noticed is that I really haven't seen a Black person sitting next to him through any of these press conferences, right? And I think the one person that I did see was Chris Rock when he had him on to talk about whatever issue. But I mean, when you really think about it, like, why isn't there somebody? I also think about the fact that I did a panel with the New York State Attorney General Tish James, who's an African-American woman, and Marilyn Mosby, the Baltimore City State's Attorney. And she raised an extraordinary point that when we're thinking about issues like criminal justice reform, 95% of the elected prosecutors in this country are white. 95% at a time when we're thinking about criminal justice reform. And what's incredible to me is that while we're thinking about processes and rules and regulations and standard operating procedures, there's still these structural challenges that exist to get folks that look like us and that are attentive to the issues that we're concerned about in decision-making positions, in positions of power where there's enough discretion, where they can make good decisions or make decisions that are reflective of our concerns. And I'll pivot to this other point because I know my brother Dean Burrell has raised this point, and it's part of any cynicism or pessimism that you may hear in my voice from time to time. I do care about and appreciate the fact that there are a lot of allies who are in this fight with us. I do appreciate that. And, I posted a picture when I was driving through Riverdale about a month or so ago, and this young white girl with her mother was standing with a Black Lives Matter poster with their fist in the air. And if anyone knows Riverdale in New York City, they're in the Bronx, they don't consider themselves part of the Bronx, they don't really talk about themselves as part of the Bronx, But here was this pro Black Lives Matter march in Riverdale, which mattered to me because that means to me that neighborhoods are changing, suburbs are changing. And if you look at the sort of way the president is polling right now, he's losing suburbs in part because of his leadership in some of these other issues, right? But I still have a skepticism related to a point that my brother Dean Burrell has made, and one of Lauren's points reminded me of this. That as much as we talk about inclusion and breaking down barriers, I think about my friends on the Upper West Side of Manhattan who were white liberals, right? Who were challenged recently because the city wanted to change the zoning lines for the schools to bring in students from Frederick Douglass houses just a couple of blocks away. And the language that came from those parents who were white liberals, right, was shocking and shockingly racist in many respects. And what that says to me is that as well-meaning as many people are, so folks have this, in some ways, knee-jerk reaction to maintaining status quo, right? To keeping things the way that they are because there's a level of comfort and privilege associated with that. So what I try to focus on is, again, not just putting individuals in positions of power and influence and in decision-making positions where they have both responsibility and authority, but also that some of these systems are so heavily embedded in our culture and in our day-to-day lives that radical action has to be taken to dismantle them, because it's so easy for folks who want to be our allies and consider themselves our allies to fall back into that same place.
Thank you, Basil. Louis, please.
Yeah, thanks, Krishna. You know, I've had the good fortune to work in a number of pretty progressive organizations, including my current organization of Korn Ferry. And I've spent my entire career in human resources, and I've also had 2 stints as a chief diversity officer. And as you mentioned, Krishna, I started my career in '81. So I've seen a number of iterations of this. And as I've been thinking about this, I think this is to me, sort of the third act around how do we create a more just society from a workplace standpoint. The first act was, I'll call that the affirmative action era that came directly out of the Civil Rights Act, where we had specific goals and timetables that government contractors had to meet in order to keep their government contracts. And as an HR person, I actually had the opportunity to put together affirmative action plans. And in fact, the first job that I had in diversity and inclusion was at that transition point where my title was affirmative action and diversity. You know, what was interesting about affirmative action, which has been, to me, very inappropriately maligned, was the fact that it was very effective because you had specific goals and timetables to reach things. But unfortunately, it got twisted into quotas and things like that, and obviously ultimately went away. But so the first act, though, was a legal act that came about, again, as a result of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The second act, to me, which I call the diversity movement. And that's when you started to see positions like chief diversity officers, and organizations began to do different types of diversity training, mostly around awareness. And we moved the needle. The challenge with that is that it excluded white men, frankly. And so there was always that tension. It's like, okay, we're talking about diversity, which was sort of a code for race and gender, people of color and women, but it's in some ways it excluded white men. The whole inclusion movement came about as a way to as the name indicates, to include them. And I call that second act sort of the intellectual act. It was about developing the business case for diversity. So it was trying to appeal to people's intellect as to why it was important to do this. And that resonated with a lot of organizations, especially consumer goods organizations that I had an opportunity to work in, and we made some good progress there over time. But then it tended to fade away. To me, we're in the third act now, and the third act has been building for a while. And I think the catalyst for that was clearly the final catalyst for that was clearly the police killing of George Floyd caught on camera. And to me, what's different about this act, and we don't know how long this is going to last, where it's going to go, but what's different about it, and Rashawn said this earlier, it's more emotional and visceral. People feel it, and not just Black people feel it, because again, we've known about these things all our lives, but white people feel it. And this whole concept of allyship has come out of this. So, you know, this area continues to evolve. Again, we don't know how long this will last, but as we talked about earlier, it feels very different to me than it has in other times. I think it's more pervasive in terms of the feeling that we need to do better. We've seen a lot of organizations come out with statements. In my business, we've seen a significant uptick in interest in diversity officer roles, as well as in diversity and inclusion consulting. And that area has continued to evolve as well. And I want to make one final point before I turn it back to you, Krishna. You know, in terms of, I think what we've learned is that there's really sort of two things that have to be addressed. One is there's structural things that have to be addressed. And there's also behavioral things that have to be addressed. I think what's one of the challenges in some of the experience we've had previously is that we addressed one without the other. And I think we did it in a very, very incomplete way. And so what we and other organizations are trying to do is let's address the structural things. Let's understand the biases that exist within our people processes inside of organizations. And then how do we train people not just to become more aware of their biases? How do we train people to fix those things? You're hearing the term become an anti-racist. So what does that mean? And I think we'll probably talk about that in a bit more, but it's really about, again, teaching people, because I think more and more people want to do the right things, but we have to teach them what the right things are and how to not just recognize where we all have biases, but how you can effectively combat them. Krishna, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Louis. And I know we have 10 minutes left now, and I just want to say that's a key takeaway right there. There's structural inequities. We have to get into those decision making. We have to be making decisions, and we have to educate, right? On the white side, on the Black side, on the whole host of people throughout the world, right? There's always been good white people. Right from the beginning, there's always been good white people. So we can't discount that, but then we want to now focus on what can we do. But I'm going to leave it at that, because I do want to get to some of these questions. These questions are important. This is of course in the real world we'd have the audience come up to the microphone and we'd talk. We're now in the Zoom, and I want to tackle one that I got right here right now, and I'm going to throw it out to you for 30 seconds, right? So, because I want to get through it. We got a lot of great questions, and I want to segue into answering some of these questions. Please, each panelist take about 30, 45 seconds so we can get through. We have a lot of questions, so let's just try to get through this. First question, and I'll throw this out to everyone. We'll go in order. Louis, Basil, Rasan, Lauren. In this new normal of COVID-19, the potential for working from home on a permanent basis, all of the big tech companies have now moved in that direction. What do you think the impact of that will be on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Louis, take it away.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think we don't know ultimately what the impact is going to be, because clearly workplace culture is changing now because we're not physically in contact with each other. I think in some ways it's going to make it easier. In some ways it's going to make it harder. I think the easier part is some of the processes for hiring people will be much more streamlined than they've been before, and I'm hopeful that more people of color in particular will get through these processes. What's going to make it harder is how do you create an inclusive culture when you're not ever when you're rarely physically together. And so
Great point.
again, people didn't evolve with Zoom. We evolved being around each other. And so I think we're still learning how best to interact with each other through this new medium. It was really a great question to ask, and I'll flip it back to you, Krishna.
Basil?
I actually echo everything that was said, in particular the point about if we're not physically together, how do you focus on inclusion, right?
Right.
But I also think about an article that I think it was in the Times of the Washington Post some weeks ago, that what this virus has done and what these changes in the workplace have done is increase the need for more skilled labor, and that may not include as many folks of color as we would like, especially as we've seen in this pandemic that so many of the jobs of essential workers, those workers were concentrated in our communities. And so I do wonder if in the long term, what this does is it further stratifies the workplace in terms of skill sets. That's actually my main concern, because I can totally see that happening, and it started already.
Right.
And we're looking also at, if you notice, there have been other reports about how residential patterns are shifting, that you're seeing more people leave the city, where we were focused on gentrification for a while. A lot of those same folks with means are leaving cities and going into the suburbs in New York, in case of New York State, going as far up as the Hudson Valley. And what that does, again, for the folks who remain, which might be concentrated is in the Black and Latino community, Black and Brown communities, and what that means for the resources that are going to be spent on those communities who are still in the cities. Will the resources, again, leave those folks and travel into other areas?
All right, I'm gonna switch it up again. New question. This is one that's going to Lauren and Rasan. Let's talk more about allyship. How can white people be an ally without it coming across as patronizing or something that has to do with white guilt, or they're guilty about their own white privilege? So let's talk about allyship. I'm gonna throw this out to Lauren. How can you be an ally without being patronizing and focusing on white guilt? Lauren.
I think it really starts with listening. It's about, instead of telling someone how to do it, how to do better or not do something, just listen, and being transparent and just being honest. When you are transparent and honest, and I had this conversation with someone yesterday who was white, and she said, she wasn't sure how to ask me a certain question, and I responded, and I'm like, we work together, we do things. And she said it was because it was such a tough conversation, and because it's been so heavy lately, she wanted to make sure I would, in essence, be okay with having the discussion. And I said, the fact that you can come to me and say that and ask that says a lot. So it's listening, it's being transparent, it's being honest, and being open to the response that you will get, and being committed to moving forward. Those are the important things.
Excellent. Rasan?
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly to that, Lauren, that it really requires our allies or potential allies to really confront their own biases, right? And their own ways of viewing people of color, conscious or subconscious, right? They have to sort of challenge that first, right? And then be open to sympathetic and empathetic to the plight of people of color in this country since we've been here. Especially highlighted with all that's going on currently, and then be committed to educating themselves around what that looks like, right? And then seeking ways to really be supportive, right? Whether it's be just having a conversation with someone who's a person of color, or reading some books, some articles, right? Confronting their own biases, and being sort of committed to themselves to move forward for change.
All right, super. All right, now
Krishna,
we're not
can I
going
answer
to.
that as well?
Yeah,
I'd
please,
like
go.
To weigh in. I just sent in the chat box a link to an article that I wrote on that I published on LinkedIn about being an ally, and I'm gonna use a term that we've heard a lot in the very recent past, but in a very different context. And that the thing I'd like to say is, you see something, you say something. We talk about that in terms of addressing terrorism. I'm saying, and you want to be an ally, similar kind of thing. I'll give you a quick story. I was in our local pizzeria the other day picking up a couple slices of pizza, and there was and I go in this place all the time, and there was a white guy in there, and he was talking about the fact that he said more white people are killed by the police than black people. And he was going on and on about, of course, not wearing a mask or anything. And I went over to him, and in a nice way, and I confronted him, and I said, "You're partially right. You are right that more white people are killed by the police than are black people. However, on a percentage basis, a black person is way more likely to be killed by that." And so we had a nice conversation. My point is, there were a number of other white people in that place that kind of let this guy kind of go on and on and on. And so we all have interactions privately, and people say incredibly racist things at various times and inappropriate things. And so one of the ways that you can be an ally as a white person, if you hear someone saying or doing something that is not right, don't just let it pass. Confront that person. This is around teaching people to behave better. And that's the second piece of what I talked about. That's the behavioral piece of this. Thanks for allowing me to jump in, Krishna.
Yeah, Basil, let's just close it out, because I think this is the education part. Please, your thoughts on that. Excellent. We have to.
Listen, I think the education is an important point. Let's just think about it this way. There are over 14,000 school districts in this country. That means there are about 14,000 different ways to teach kids. There are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. That means there are 18,000 ways to police and engage in public safety in this country. The point that I'm making is that, when you go back to education, we just heard from someone talk about not wanting to teach 1619 in schools, right?
Yeah.
We don't have a cohesive way of teaching the history of this country and the history of oppressed peoples in this country. We've never had it. We still don't have it. And you can see how intent folks are in fighting against that kind of instruction. If it doesn't start as a child, when you're a child in school, in your formative years, where it's going to be that much more difficult to try to engage that adult, to teach that adult how to give up all of what they've learned, undo their sort of bias, which I talked about, undo some of those biases, and start to engage in a way that's meaningful and supportive of the communities that are asking for these kinds of changes or pushing for these kinds of changes. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. So from my perspective, from the education point of view, it needs to start much, much earlier. And you can see, and this is why I always talk about representation, it is extremely important to have folks in positions of power, the decision makers, to instill in folks and to create systems, and in the case of schools, curriculum that actually teaches this stuff well before folks get into adulthood and are in positions of power, and then you have to get them to give up some of that power and to share some of that power to become an ally. They can best become an ally when they understand what being an ally means, right, at a much younger age.
All right, and that, ladies and gentlemen, will have to be the final word. I feel like Fareed Zakari, we're not going to commercial break, but it is 1:01. And let me just say that there's been a ton of questions. I couldn't get to all of them. We might have another, we do have a series of these panels coming up, one in August, one in September, one each month. We'll probably revisit with this panel, this group, because we had some great questions lined up. I want to thank Lauren, Rasan, Basil, and Louis today. I want to thank the ILR School. Of course, big shout out to Jordan Berman, the president. We heard Dee Burrell earlier, Dean Burrell. He's one of really one of the leaders in the ILR Black community for many years in mentoring Black students. 79, 78, one of those years, Dean, that you came out. But I want to thank Sue Sappington, and I want to thank Allison. Thank you all. We had 430 registrants, shattered records for this. So thank you all. And let's keep the conversation going in our communities. Keep it going, keep it going. We can make America a better place, a more just and equal place. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.